Tell that old woman to leave the table, or I will." The room went silent. Even the silverware seemed to stop breathing. Edward Langford stood at the head of the long dining table inside his family's old estate in Newport, Rhode Island, surrounded by candlelight, crystal glasses, and people who had known his name since the day he was born. He was 42 now, a billionaire with hotels across the country, a man whose picture appeared in business magazines beside words like discipline, power, and legacy. But in that moment, he looked less like a powerful man and more like a frightened boy. Across from him sat his fiancée, Vanessa Hart, beautiful in a cream silk dress, her blonde hair pinned neatly behind one ear, her smile polished enough to fool a room and sharp enough to cut it. Beside the fireplace stood Miss Ruth Coleman, 71 years old, a black woman with soft grey curls, warm brown eyes, and hands that had spent a lifetime carrying trays, folding blankets, cooling fevers, and wiping tears no one else had noticed. Miss Ruth was not blood, but she had been there when blood was all Edward had left to lose. Edward's mother, Eleanor Langford, had passed away when Edward was only 6. Before that final winter ended, Ruth had been the nurse who sat by Eleanor's bed each night, reading psalms in a low voice, and holding her hand when pain made words impossible. After Eleanor was gone, Ruth stayed. Not because a contract required it, not because money chained her to the house. She stayed because a little boy kept waking up in the dark, calling for a mother who would never answer. For 36 years, Ruth had been there. She made Edward oatmeal when he refused to eat. She sat outside his bedroom door when grief turned him silent. She taught him to knot a tie before boarding school. She mailed him birthday cakes to college, even when he pretended he was too old for such things. And when his first hotel opened, she stood in the back of the crowd, clapping with tears in her eyes. Yet tonight, in his own dining room, the woman who had raised him stood like an unwanted guest. Vanessa lifted her glass and laughed softly. "I'm sorry," she said, though nothing in her voice sounded sorry. "I just didn't realize staff ate with the family in this house." Edward's younger cousin, Margaret, lowered her fork. "She always eats with us," Margaret said. "How generous," Vanessa replied. "But generosity can become confusing. People start forgetting their place." Miss Ruth's face did not change. That was one of the first things Edward had learned about her. Pain rarely entered through her eyes. It settled somewhere deeper, somewhere private. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. Vanessa turned to him. "Darling, you cannot build a life with me while letting old attachments run your home. I respect tradition, but this is embarrassing." A faint tremor passed through Ruth's fingers. She folded them in front of her apron. "I can take my dinner in the kitchen, Mr. Edward," she said gently. Mr. Edward. He had not heard her call him that since the day he turned 18 and told her he was too grown to be fussed over. Something moved inside him then, but it did not rise fast enough. "Ruth," he said quietly, "no one is asking you to leave." Vanessa smiled. "I am." The words landed like a slap. No one breathed. Miss Ruth gave a small nod, the kind of nod people give when they have been hurt too often to make a scene of it. "If that is what makes the evening easier," she said, "I understand." She turned toward the kitchen, and Edward watched her go. He watched the woman who had held his mother's last letter, the woman who had raised him through every lonely season of his life, walk away from the table like a servant dismissed by a stranger. Still, he said nothing. Outside, rain began tapping against the tall windows. Inside, Vanessa reached for his hand and whispered, "You did the right thing." But Edward felt no victory. Only the sudden, terrible memory of being 6 years old, crying in a dark hallway, while Miss Ruth knelt in front of him and said, "As long as I am here, baby, you will never be alone." Now she was the one walking away alone, and he had let her. Miss Ruth did not cry in the kitchen. That was the first thing young Brianna noticed. Brianna was 19, the youngest house assistant on the Langford estate, with nervous hands and a heart too honest for a place filled with polished lies. She had seen people cry after less, a sharp word, a broken glass, a look from someone rich enough to make kindness feel optional. But Miss Ruth only stood by the sink, carefully folding the linen napkin she had carried from the dining room. "Miss Ruth," Brianna whispered, "you should not have left. She had no right." Ruth smiled faintly, though the smile never reached her eyes. "Child, rights and kindness are not always invited to the same table. That was cruel." "Yes," Ruth said softly. "It was." Brianna waited for anger. She wanted anger. Anger would have made sense. Anger would have been easier to bear than the quiet way Ruth reached for a clean plate and began preparing a small supper for herself, as if being sent away was only another task in the evening. From the dining room came Vanessa's laughter, light, elegant, satisfied. Brianna looked toward the sound with tears burning behind her eyes. "Mr. Edward should have stopped her." Ruth's hand paused over the breadbasket. For a moment, the old woman seemed smaller beneath the kitchen light. Not weak. Never weak. Only tired, in a way that had taken many years to arrive. "Yes," she said. "He should have." Back in the dining room, Edward sat beside Vanessa while conversations struggled to return to normal. Someone asked about the weather. Someone mentioned a charity gala in Boston. Someone praised the wine, though no one seemed to taste it. Edward tasted nothing. He could still see Ruth turning away. Vanessa leaned close, her perfume warm and expensive. "You see," she murmured, "that was not so difficult. Boundaries are healthy." Edward looked at her. For the first time that evening, her beauty seemed almost theatrical to him. Perfect hair, perfect dress, perfect smile. But underneath it, something cold had been allowed to breathe freely. "She raised me," he said. Vanessa's smile did not falter. "And I respect that, truly. But childhood attachments become unhealthy when grown men cannot separate gratitude from dependence." Margaret set her glass down too hard. "Vanessa, she is not an attachment. She is family." Vanessa tilted her head. "Family? That is an interesting word to use for a paid employee." Edward felt his chest tighten. Paid employee. He remembered Ruth sitting beside his bed when scarlet fever nearly took him at 8. He remembered her staying awake 3 nights in a chair, dipping cloths in cool water, whispering prayers into the dark. He remembered being 12, punching a wall after his father forgot his birthday, and Ruth rapping his bleeding knuckles without scolding him once. He remembered her saying, "Pain is not an excuse to become hard, Edward. It is a reason to become careful." Now he had become careful in the wrong way. Careful not to upset Vanessa. Careful not to make a scene. Careful enough to wound the one person who had never wounded him. Dinner ended early. Guests drifted into the sitting room, speaking in low voices. Edward excused himself and walked down the hall toward the kitchen, each step heavier than the last. He stopped outside the open doorway. Ruth sat alone at the small wooden table near the pantry, eating a modest plate of soup and bread. Brianna stood beside her, pretending to polish silver, so Ruth would not have to feel watched. For a few seconds, Edward could not move. The kitchen was where his life had been saved many times, though no newspaper would ever write that. It was where Ruth had taught him to read when grief made school impossible, where she had hidden birthday candles in muffins, where she had let him be a child after everyone else expected him to become a Langford too soon. "Ruth," he said. She looked up. Not coldly, that would have been easier. She looked at him with the same gentleness she had always carried, and that gentleness nearly broke him. "Do you need something, Mr.
Edward?"
There it was again. Mr. Edward. He stepped inside. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Ruth placed her spoon down carefully. "That is kind of you." The formality in her voice hurt worse than anger. "I did not want tonight to become unpleasant," he said. Brianna turned away, unable to hide her disappointment. Ruth studied him for a long moment. "Sometimes, son, unpleasant things do not become unpleasant because someone speaks. They become unpleasant because no one does." Edward lowered his eyes. Before he could answer, Vanessa appeared in the hallway behind him. "There you are," she said brightly. "Everyone is waiting." Then she glanced at Ruth's plate and laughed under her breath. "Oh, I see. A private apology to the help?" The kitchen went still. Edward looked at Ruth. Ruth looked down at her folded hands. And once again, the room waited to see what kind of man Edward Langford truly was. Vanessa's laughter stayed in the kitchen longer than she did. It seemed to cling to the walls, thin and bright and cruel, while everyone stood still beneath it. Edward turned toward her slowly. For one brief second, Brianna believed he would finally say it. She believed the man who owned hotels, signed million-dollar contracts, and faced boardrooms without blinking would find the courage to defend the woman who had raised him. But Vanessa crossed the kitchen as if she owned the air itself. "Edward," she said, slipping her hand through his arm, "you cannot keep disappearing every time someone gets emotional. Your guests are asking questions." Ruth rose from the small wooden chair. "I should finish clearing the dining room," she said. "No," Brianna said before she could stop herself. Vanessa looked at the girl as if noticing a stain on the floor. "Excuse me?" Brianna's face turned pale, but she did not step back. "I said no." "Miss Ruth has done enough tonight." A silence fell. Edward looked at Brianna, surprised by the strength in her small voice. Brianna swallowed hard, but her eyes stayed wet and steady. Vanessa smiled. "How sweet. The little maid has opinions now." "Brianna," Ruth said gently, "that is enough." But Brianna shook her head. "No, ma'am, it is not enough. You have spent this whole evening letting people hurt you because you do not want trouble. But trouble is already here." Edward felt the words land exactly where he had tried not to look. Vanessa released a soft sigh. "This is what happens when a household forgets structure. Everyone begins confusing employment with importance." Ruth lowered her eyes. Edward saw it then, not as a dramatic collapse, not as a wound anyone could photograph, but as something much worse. He saw a woman learning to expect less from him. That was the part that frightened him. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "go back to the sitting room." She blinked. "What?" "I need a moment." Her smile hardened. "With her?" "With myself." For the first time that evening, Vanessa had no quick answer. She looked from Edward to Ruth, then to Brianna, and gave a small laugh that tried to sound amused. "Fine," she said. "Take your moment." but do not embarrass me in my own engagement dinner." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking across the marble hall. Edward waited until the sound faded. Then he looked at Ruth. "I am sorry." Ruth nodded once. "I know you are." Her answer was kind, but it did not comfort him. "No," he said, "I do not think I have earned that yet." Ruth's hands rested against the back of the chair. Her fingers were thin now, lined with age, but Edward could still remember them strong around his shoulders when he had cried himself breathless after his mother's funeral. "I should have stopped her," he said. "Yes," Ruth answered. The honesty startled him. She had forgiven many things in his life. Broken promises, forgotten visits, birthdays when he sent flowers through an assistant instead of coming home. But tonight she did not cover his failure with softness. "I told myself I was keeping peace," Edward said. Ruth looked at him with quiet sadness. "Peace for whom, son?" He had no answer. Brianna wiped her cheek and stepped back toward the sink, giving them space, but not leaving Ruth alone. Edward pulled out the chair across from Ruth and sat down at the kitchen table. It was the same table where he had once done spelling lessons, the same table where Ruth had taught him to write thank-you notes after every Christmas gift. For a moment, the years folded in on themselves. He was 6 again, swinging his legs beneath the chair, refusing to eat. Ruth was younger then, her hair still black, her voice low and steady. "Your mother asked me to look after you," she had told him. "So I will." "Not because I am paid to, but because a promise is a holy thing." Edward looked up sharply. The memory came so suddenly that it almost took his breath. "A promise," he whispered. Ruth's face changed. "What did you say?" "You told me once that Mother asked you to look after me." Ruth's fingers tightened on the chair. "She did." Was there something else? The kitchen seemed to grow colder. Ruth looked toward the hallway, then back at him. "Edward, this is not the night." Was there something else? He asked again. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, as if the past had been sitting beside her all along. "Your mother left a letter," she said softly. Edward went still. "A letter?" "She asked me to keep it until the day you were old enough to understand what family really meant." His voice became almost a whisper. "And you never gave it to me?" "No," Ruth said, "because until tonight, I thought you already understood." The words struck harder than any accusation. Before Edward could speak, Vanessa's voice rang from the hall. "Edward, are you coming or not?" Ruth folded her napkin, slow and careful. Edward looked toward the doorway, then back at the woman who had carried his mother's last secret for 36 years. And for the first time that night, he did not move when Vanessa called. Vanessa called his name a second time. Edward did not answer. For most of his adult life, he had moved toward the loudest demand in the room, a ringing phone, a board waiting for his decision, a partner needing reassurance, a fiancée expecting obedience wrapped in charm. He had mistaken urgency for importance so many times that he had almost forgotten the difference. But now, in the quiet kitchen where the lamps glowed soft against old wood and copper pans, only one thing mattered. "My mother left me a letter," he said. Ruth looked down at the table. "Yes." "And you kept it all these years?" "I kept it safe." "Why did no one tell me?" "Because your mother did not want the letter opened out of grief," Ruth said. "She wanted it opened out of understanding." Edward let out a slow breath. In the dining room, voices rose and fell, Glasses chimed. People pretended not to notice the fracture running through the house. Brianna stood near the sink, silent now, as if even she understood they had entered a room inside the past where no careless word belonged. "Where is it?" Edward asked. Ruth's eyes lifted to his. "In the cedar box in my room." He knew the box. He had seen it many times when he was a boy. Ruth kept it on the top shelf of her wardrobe, wrapped in a faded blue scarf. Once, when he was 9, he asked what was inside. "Old things," she had told him. He had not known old things could carry the weight of a life. Edward stood. "May I read it?" Ruth was quiet for so long that he feared she would refuse. Then she nodded. "Yes, son. I believe tonight has come." They walked together through the staff hallway, narrow and dim compared with the rest of the estate. Ruth moved slowly, one hand brushing the wall for balance. Edward noticed her limp for the first time in years, or perhaps he noticed that he had stopped noticing. Her room was at the end of the east wing, modest and spotless. A narrow bed, a quilt folded with care, a small framed photograph of Edward at 8 years old, missing 2 front teeth, standing beside Ruth in the garden. On the dresser sat a Bible, a tin of peppermint candies, and a photograph of Edward Langford. Edward stopped before it. His mother's face looked younger than memory, delicate but bright, with the same gray eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. He had spent decades building towers with her name hidden inside them, yet somehow he had let the woman she trusted most be insulted under his roof. Ruth opened the wardrobe and reached for the cedar box. Her hands trembled when she brought it down. Inside were folded handkerchiefs, yellowed postcards, a small silver cross, and one envelope sealed long ago with pale wax. On the front, in handwriting Edward recognized from old birthday cards, were 4 words. "For my Edward, someday." His throat tightened. Ruth placed the envelope in his hands. "She wrote it 3 nights before she passed," Ruth said. "She was weak, but she insisted every word be her own." Edward stared at the paper. He had negotiated with men who tried to ruin him. He had stood before investors after markets collapsed. He had signed documents worth more than entire towns. But this envelope frightened him, because inside it was not business. It was truth. A knock sounded at the door. Vanessa entered without waiting. "There you are," she said, then stopped when she saw the envelope. "What is this?" Edward did not answer. Vanessa looked around Ruth's small room with visible distaste. "Edward, your guests are confused, and frankly, so am I. You left your own engagement dinner to stand in a housekeeper's bedroom?" Ruth closed her eyes. Brianna, who had followed at a distance, stepped into the doorway. "Miss Hart, please." Vanessa turned sharply. "No, I am done being polite in a house where employees are treated like royalty, and I am treated like an intruder." Edward looked up then. The room changed. Not loudly, not violently, but something in his face settled into place. "You are an intruder," he said quietly, "when you enter a room without respect." Vanessa's lips parted. Edward looked down at the envelope once more. Then, with Ruth beside him and his fiancée watching from the doorway, he broke the old seal and unfolded his mother's final letter. The first line nearly took him to his knees. "My dearest boy, if Ruth is standing near you when you read this, then God has answered my last prayer." Edward could not breathe. The room blurred around the edges, but the handwriting remained clear, delicate, and familiar. Every letter shaped by a hand he had not held since childhood. He read on. "I do not know how old you will be when this letter finds you. Perhaps you will be a young man. Perhaps you will already have gray in your hair. But I know this much. Ruth Coleman will still be near you if life has been kind enough to keep her there. Edward's fingers tightened around the paper. Vanessa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, impatience flickering across her face. She did not understand what had just entered the room. To her, it was only an old letter. To Edward, it was his mother's voice returning from 36 years of silence. Ruth kept her eyes lowered. Edward continued reading, but now his voice trembled. Your father gave you a name. I gave you my heart. But Ruth gave you the part of motherhood I could not stay to give. When the nights became painful and I feared leaving you more than I feared death, Ruth sat beside me and promised she would not let you grow up alone. A sound escaped Edward, small and broken. He saw it suddenly. Ruth, younger, sitting in the dim sick room beside his mother. Eleanor, pale against the pillows, too weak to lift him, but strong enough to worry for him. Ruth taking a promise that would cost her the rest of her life. The letter shook in his hand. Do not ever let anyone call her merely a servant. That word is too small for what she has been to this family. She has been my hands when I could not hold you. She has been my voice when I could no longer comfort you. She has been a shelter over your life. Brianna covered her mouth. Ruth turned slightly toward the window, but Edward saw the tear that slipped down her cheek. He had seen Ruth cry only twice in his life. Once when his father died. Once when Edward opened his first hotel and thanked everyone from investors to architects, but forgot to mention her. He had forgotten so much. Edward forced himself to keep reading. Someday, you may become a powerful man. People may stand when you enter rooms. They may praise your judgment, your wealth, your name. But remember this, my son. A man is not measured by how he treats those who impress him. He is measured by how he protects those who loved him before he had anything to offer. Vanessa shifted. This is touching, she said coldly. But surely we do not need to perform the whole thing right now. Edward looked up. For the first time, there was no confusion in his eyes. Be quiet. The words were not shouted, but they struck the room with more force than anger. Vanessa froze. Edward looked back down at the letter. If the day ever comes when Ruth is made to feel small in your home, do not ask whether the insult is convenient to answer.
Do not ask whether silence will keep the evening pleasant. Speak. Stand. Remember who stayed when staying was not easy. His chest tightened so sharply, he placed one hand against the dresser. Ruth reached toward him. Edward, sit down. But he shook his head. No, I need to finish. There is one more thing you must know. I asked Ruth, before I died, what she wanted in return for all she had given us. She asked for nothing. Not money, not property, not recognition. Only this. Let him grow into a kind man. Edward lowered the letter. The room was silent except for rain against the glass. He could not look at Ruth at first. Shame has a way of making love difficult to face. At last he turned to her. You asked for nothing. Ruth gave a sad, gentle smile. I had enough, son. I had you. That was when Edward finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply bent forward, one hand still holding the letter, and covered his eyes like the 6-year-old boy who had once lost everything. Ruth stepped toward him out of instinct. Even wounded, even humiliated, she reached for him. Her hand touched his shoulder, and that kindness hurt him more than Vanessa's cruelty ever could. From the doorway, Vanessa let out a sharp breath.
"So this is what we are doing now?" she said. "You are going to let an old housekeeper and a dead woman decide our future?" Edward slowly lowered his hand. He looked at Vanessa as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "No," he said. "You decided our future the moment you showed me your heart." Vanessa's face changed. The rain outside grew heavier. Edward folded his mother's letter with reverence, placed it against his chest, and turned toward the hallway. "Come," he said to Ruth. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the dining room," Edward answered. "Everyone heard you be insulted there. Everyone will hear the truth there, too." When Edward stepped back into the dining room, the conversation died before he said a word. Everyone saw the change in him. It was not anger exactly. Anger burns too quickly. This was heavier, quieter, the kind of resolve that comes when a man has finally looked at himself and disliked what he found. Miss Ruth walked beside him, though she tried to stay half a step behind. Old habits are not easily broken. For most of her life, she had entered grand rooms quietly, careful not to disturb the people who believed the house belonged only to them. Edward noticed. He stopped, turned gently, and offered her his arm. "Please," he said. Ruth looked at him with surprise. Then, slowly, she placed her hand on his sleeve. Across the room, Vanessa stood near the fireplace, her face tight with embarrassment. Margaret sat very still. Brianna hovered near the doorway, her eyes red but hopeful. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, already sensing that the evening had moved beyond polite repair. Edward led Ruth to the head of the table, his chair. He pulled it out for her. A quiet murmur passed through the room. Ruth shook her head. "Edward, no." "Yes," he said softly. "Tonight, yes." She looked at the chair as if it were not made of wood and velvet, but of every invisible line she had been taught not to cross. "I am comfortable standing," she whispered. "I am not comfortable letting you stand there after what happened." For a moment, Ruth's lips trembled. Then she sat. Edward remained beside her. Vanessa gave a brittle laugh. "This is absurd." Edward looked at her. "No, what happened earlier was absurd. This is overdue." Vanessa's cheeks flushed. "Edward, do not humiliate me in front of everyone." He let the words settle before answering. "You humiliated yourself when you tried to shame a woman who never harmed you." A guest near the end of the table lowered his eyes. Edward lifted the letter. "This was written by my mother, Eleanor Langford, 3 nights before she died." The room changed again. Even Vanessa seemed to lose some color. Edward unfolded the paper carefully. "My mother asked Ruth Coleman to stay with me after she was gone. Ruth promised her she would, not for money, not for position, not for comfort. She stayed because my mother feared leaving a 6-year-old boy alone in a house too large for his grief." Ruth closed her eyes. Edward's voice held steady, though his hands did not. "For 36 years, Miss Ruth did what many people with our name failed to do. She showed up. She sat beside hospital beds. She remembered birthdays. She softened rooms that had grown cold. She gave love without making a performance of it." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. Edward looked around the table. "Earlier tonight she was called staff, as if that word could erase a lifetime. She was asked to leave this table as if she had not earned a place here long before any of us sat down." Vanessa stepped forward. "I never said she did not matter. I only said there should be boundaries." Edward turned toward her fully. "No, Vanessa. You said people should know their place." Vanessa swallowed. And perhaps they should. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Edward stared at her, not with shock now, but with sorrowful certainty. You still believe it. She lifted her chin. I believe a man in your position has to be careful. People use emotion to gain influence. She may be kind, Edward, but she is still an employee. Ruth flinched. Edward saw it. That small movement decided everything. He placed the letter on the table beside Ruth's hand. Then let me make her position clear. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Edward looked at every person in the room.
Miss Ruth Coleman is not an employee to be tolerated. She is not a relic from my childhood. She is not an old woman taking up space in this house. His voice deepened. She is the woman who raised me. She is the woman my mother trusted with her dying prayer. She is my family. The room fell completely silent. Then Margaret stood. One by one, others followed. Not with applause, not at first, but with the quiet respect that should have been given from the beginning. Brianna began to cry openly. Ruth looked up at Edward. There was pain in her face still, but beneath it, something long denied had begun to breathe. Vanessa looked around and realized she was alone. You are choosing her over me? She asked. Edward did not hesitate. I am choosing the truth over pride. Her mouth tightened. You will regret this. Edward looked at his mother's letter, then at Ruth. No, he said. I have already done enough regretting tonight. He turned to the butler near the doorway. Please have Miss Hart's things brought down.
Vanessa went still. Edward's voice remained calm. The engagement is over. For several seconds, no one moved. Vanessa stared at Edward as if the words had reached her late. You cannot be serious, Vanessa said. Edward stood beside Miss Ruth, his mother's letter resting on the table between them. I have never been more serious. A thin laugh escaped Vanessa's throat. Over her? Edward did not answer immediately. He looked down at Ruth, seated in the chair she had never asked for, in the place she had always deserved. Her eyes were lowered, not out of shame now, but sorrow. Even after everything, she did not seem pleased to see another person cast out. That was Ruth. She could be wounded and still grieve the wound inside someone else. Edward turned back to Vanessa. No, he said, not over her. Because of you. Vanessa stepped toward him. I made one mistake. Brianna looked up sharply from the doorway. One? She whispered.
Vanessa ignored her. I was uncomfortable, that is all. I walked into a house where the lines are blurred and everyone pretends it is normal. I tried to protect our future. Our future, Edward said, would have required me to become smaller every day until I no longer recognized myself. Her eyes flashed. You are being manipulated. Edward almost smiled, but there was no joy in it. By kindness? By guilt, Vanessa snapped. By an old promise. By a woman who has had decades to make herself necessary. A sound moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet recoil of decent people hearing something they could not excuse. Ruth's hands folded in her lap. Edward noticed the way she was trying to disappear again. He would not allow it. Miss Ruth never made herself necessary, he said. She became necessary by doing what love does. She stayed. Vanessa's mouth trembled, but pride held her upright. You will regret humiliating me. Edward's voice lowered. You mistook correction for humiliation. That is not the same thing. The butler entered quietly with Vanessa's coat draped over one arm. Behind him, a housemaid carried a small evening bag from the guest suite. Vanessa looked at the coat, then at the room full of witnesses. So this is how the great Edward Langford ends his engagement. Publicly, cruelly. Edward breathed in. Earlier that evening, he might have apologized, just to soften the air. He might have explained too much. He might have chosen comfort over truth. But his mother's words still lived in his chest. Speak. Stand. Remember. I am not trying to be cruel, he said, but I will not protect your pride at the cost of her dignity. Vanessa's eyes glistened now, though whether from pain or rage, Edward could not tell. You think she loves you more than I do. Miss Ruth rose slightly. Edward, she said softly, you do not need to compare love. He looked at her, and something in him steadied. No, I do not. Then he faced Vanessa once more. Love does not need to make someone else small to feel powerful. Love does not laugh when an old woman is hurt. Love does not ask a man to be ashamed of the person who raised him. Vanessa stood very still. For the first time all night, she seemed less like a queen losing a throne, and more like a girl who had spent her whole life believing beauty and status could excuse a heart left untended. But regret did not come. Not truly. Her face hardened again. You will hear from my family. Edward nodded. If they ask why the wedding is cancelled, tell them the truth. And what truth is that? That I finally listened to my mother. The words left the room silent. Vanessa took her coat from the butler. As she passed Ruth, she paused just long enough for everyone to fear one final insult. But Edward stepped between them, not aggressively, simply firmly. Vanessa looked at him, then passed him to Ruth. For a moment, the mask cracked. Then she turned and walked out. The front door opened. Rain swept in across the marble floor. The door closed again. And the Langford house, after holding its breath all evening, seemed to exhale. No one applauded. No one celebrated. There were moments too solemn for applause. Edward turned slowly toward Miss Ruth. She was standing now, one hand on the back of the chair, her face unreadable. He crossed the few steps between them. I should have done that sooner, he said. Yes, Ruth answered. The honesty cut him, but he accepted it. I hurt you. Yes, she said again. His eyes lowered. I do not know how to repair 36 years of taking you for granted. Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched his cheek, the way she had when he was small and feverish and afraid. You do not repair a life in one speech, son, she said. You repair it in the days after. Edward closed his eyes. For the first time that night, he understood. The grand gesture had ended. The real work was about to begin. The rain stopped before midnight. By then, most of the guests had gone home quietly, carrying with them a story they would repeat in careful voices for years to come. Not because a wedding had ended. Newport had seen broken engagements before. But because a proud man had opened his mother's final letter and found, inside it, the measure of his own failure. The Langford estate grew still. The staff cleared the dining room without speaking much. Margaret kissed Miss Ruth on the cheek before leaving, whispering, You should have had that chair years ago. Ruth only smiled and squeezed her hand. Edward stood near the fireplace, watching the last car disappear down the wet driveway. The great house reflected itself in the dark windows. Chandeliers, marble, portraits, everything expensive, everything quiet. For the first time in years, it all seemed smaller than the kitchen table where Ruth had eaten alone.
"Son?"
Edward turned.
Miss Ruth stood in the doorway with a folded shawl over her shoulders. She looked tired now. Not defeated, but worn down by the kind of evening no 71-year-old woman should have had to endure. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "I do not think I can." Ruth nodded, as if she had expected that. "Then walk with me." They moved through the east hallway, past old family portraits and brass lamps dimmed for the night. Edward slowed his steps to match hers. Years ago, Ruth had slowed for him when he was small. Now the rhythm had changed. They reached the sunroom, where Eleanor Langford used to keep white roses in blue glass vases. The room smelled faintly of rain and old wood. Ruth sat on the wicker sofa. Edward remained standing until she gave him a look. "Sit down, Edward."
"You are not on trial." He sat. For a while, neither spoke. Then Edward said, "Why did you stay?"
Ruth looked toward the dark garden. "After your mother died?" "After that. After all the years I forgot things. After I became busy. After I let this house turn you into a memory while you were still living in it." Ruth's face softened, but she did not rush to comfort him. "That is a hard question. I deserve a hard answer." She folded her hands in her lap. "At first, I stayed because I promised your mother. Then I stayed because you were a child who needed someone. Later, I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the boy I had raised." Edward swallowed. "And now?" Ruth looked at him then. "Now I am asking myself the same question." The words struck him quietly. He nodded, though pain moved across his face. "I understand." "No," Ruth said gently. "You are beginning to." He lowered his eyes. "I do not want you to leave." "I know. But if staying hurts you, I have no right to ask it." For the first time that night, Ruth's expression changed with something close to relief. Not happiness. Relief. As though she had waited many years for Edward to understand that love was not ownership. "That is the first honest thing you have said since dinner," she told him. Edward gave a sad breath of laughter. "I thought the apology was honest." "It was, but apology is only the door. This is the room." He looked at her, trying to memorize the lesson. Ruth reached into the pocket of her shawl and took out Eleanor's letter. Edward had left it with her after the guests departed, unable to carry it without feeling he might break it. "Your mother wanted you to become a kind man," Ruth said. "Not a perfect one, a kind one. I failed her tonight." "You failed me tonight," Ruth said. "Your mother is beyond being hurt by you. I am not." The truth silenced him.
Ruth's voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. "That is why we must speak plainly. If I stay, I will not stay as a shadow. I will not be hidden in the kitchen when guests arrive. I will not be introduced as someone who helps around the house, as if my life can be reduced to chores." Edward nodded. "No, never again." "And I will not be honored tonight and forgotten next month." He looked up quickly. "I will not let that happen." "You cannot promise what you have not practiced." There was no cruelty in her voice, only wisdom. Edward sat back, humbled. "Then teach me how to practice it." Ruth studied him for a long time. Outside, water dripped from the roof in slow, steady beats. "At breakfast tomorrow," she said, "you will sit with me at the kitchen table. Not because anyone is watching,
Not because you feel guilty, but because you remember where you came from. Edward's eyes filled. I will. And after breakfast, you will call the lawyer. He frowned.
The lawyer? Ruth handed him the letter.
Your mother left more than words, son. Edward looked down at the old envelope. For the first time, he noticed a second folded page tucked behind the letter. Ruth's voice was soft. She left instructions, too. At 7 the next morning, Edward Langford sat at the kitchen table. Not in the dining room beneath the chandelier, not in the breakfast room where silver trays waited under polished lids. He sat in the kitchen, where the morning light came through plain curtains and warmed the worn wooden table that had known more truth than any boardroom he had ever entered. Miss Ruth stood at the stove making oatmeal. Edward almost told her she did not need to cook. The words rose by habit, but he stopped them before they left his mouth. This was not about preventing her from doing what she loved. It was about seeing her while she did it. So he stood instead and took 2 bowls from the cabinet. Ruth glanced over her shoulder.
You remember where those are?
I remember more than I thought, he said. A small smile touched her mouth. They ate quietly at first. Outside, the garden still shone from last night's rain. Brianna came in carrying fresh towels, saw Edward at the kitchen table, and nearly dropped them. Good morning, Mr. Langford, she said. Good morning, Brianna. She looked from him to Ruth, then smiled so wide she had to look away. After breakfast, Edward kept his promise. He called the family attorney, Mr. Daniel Reeves, who had served the Langfords for nearly 40 years. Reeves arrived before noon, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the solemn expression of a man who had spent his life keeping other people's secrets. They met in the library. Ruth sat in an armchair near the window. Edward sat beside her, not across the room, not behind the desk, beside her. Mr. Reeves opened his briefcase and removed a sealed folder. I wondered when this day would come, he said.
Edward looked at him sharply. You knew?
I knew Mrs. Langford left certain instructions. I did not know when Miss Coleman would decide you were ready to hear them. Ruth looked down at her hands. Edward turned to her. You carried this alone, too? Some things are not heavy when they are carried for love, she said. But they do become heavy when love is forgotten. Edward accepted the rebuke silently. Mr. Reeves unfolded the second page from Eleanor's letter. Your mother was very clear, he said. She created a trust for Miss Ruth Coleman, a private residence, lifetime medical care, and independent financial support. She wanted Miss Coleman protected whether she remained in this house or chose a life of her own. Ruth closed her eyes. Edward stared at the attorney. She never used it? No, Mr. Reeves said. Miss Coleman refused to activate it while you were still young. Later, she said the house was enough. Edward looked at Ruth in disbelief.
You could have had your own home all this time? Ruth smiled sadly. I had a home, Edward. Or I believed I did. The words hurt because they were not meant to punish. They were simply true. Mr. Reeves continued. There is one more instruction. Edward braced himself. Mrs. Langford requested that, when the time came, you personally transfer the title of the cottage on Rose Harbor to Miss Coleman. Not as charity, not as payment, as recognition. Edward knew the cottage. A small white house overlooking the water, quiet and bright, with roses climbing the fence each summer. His mother had loved that place. Ruth's hand went to her chest. No, she whispered. Eleanor loved that cottage. Yes, Mr. Reeves said gently. Which is why she left it to you.
Edward turned to Ruth, the shame in him now mingled with wonder. "All these years," he said, "you never asked." Ruth's eyes glistened. "Love that has to ask to be seen is a lonely kind of love." Edward lowered his head.
For a long moment, the library was silent except for the old clock above the mantel. Then Edward stood and walked to his desk. He took out his pen, the same gold pen he used to sign hotel acquisitions and contracts men celebrated for months. But his hand trembled more now than it ever had in business. Mr. Reeves placed the documents before him. Edward signed each page carefully. When it was done, he did not feel generous. He felt late. He carried the signed papers to Ruth and knelt beside her chair. "Miss Ruth," he said, his voice low, "this should never have waited for my guilt to wake it up. My mother saw your worth. I should have seen it every day." Ruth touched the papers but did not take them yet. "I do not need a house to forgive you." "I know," Edward said. "That is why this is not for forgiveness." He placed the documents in her hands. "This is for dignity." Ruth looked at the title papers, then at Edward. Tears slipped down her cheeks freely now, not from humiliation, but from a grief finally being named and a love finally being honored. Brianna stood in the doorway, crying quietly. Mr. Reeves removed his glasses. Edward remained on one knee. "Will you let me take you there today?" he asked. Ruth looked toward the window, where sunlight rested on the garden she had tended for half her life. Then she looked back at the boy she had raised. "Yes, son," she said softly. "I think I would like to see what your mother remembered for me." The cottage on Rose Harbor looked smaller than Edward remembered. It stood at the edge of a quiet road where the ocean could be heard before it was seen, a white wooden house with blue shutters, a stone path, and rose bushes climbing along the fence as if they had been waiting patiently for someone to come home. Miss Ruth sat beside Edward in the back seat of the car, holding the folder of title papers on her lap with both hands. She had not spoken much during the drive. Every few minutes, she looked out at the water, then down at the papers, as if afraid the gift might vanish if she trusted it too quickly. Edward noticed. He did not rush her. For years, he had rushed through love, sent flowers instead of visiting, sent checks instead of listening, sent apologies after forgetting. Now he was learning that some things could not be repaired at the speed of business. The car stopped at the gate. Edward stepped out first, then opened Ruth's door. She looked at the cottage through the window, her eyes shining. "Your mother brought me here once," she said softly. "Before you were born." Edward turned to her. "She did?" Ruth nodded. "She said this was the only place where the Langford name felt quiet. No expectations, no guests, no grand dinners. Just wind, roses, and enough peace to hear your own heart." Edward looked toward the house. "That sounds like her." "It was her," Ruth said. She took his hand and stepped carefully from the car. Brianna had come with them, sitting in the front beside the driver. She carried a small basket Ruth had packed without telling anyone. Tea, biscuits, 2 linen napkins, and a jar of peach preserves she had made the summer before. "I thought," Ruth said, almost shyly, "if a house is going to become a home, it should begin with something warm." Edward smiled. They walked the stone path together. At the front door, Edward handed Ruth the key. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened the door. Sunlight poured across polished floors. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar, salt air, and old roses.
White curtains moved in the breeze from an open window. In the sitting room, a faded armchair faced the sea. On the mantel stood a framed photograph Edward had never seen before. His mother and Ruth, both young, both smiling. Eleanor seated in the garden, Ruth standing beside her with one hand on the back of the chair.
There was no distance between them in the photograph, no class, no title, no servant and mistress. Only two women who had trusted each other with life's heaviest promise. Ruth touched the frame with trembling fingers. "She kept this here," she whispered. Edward stood behind her, unable to speak. For so many years, he had believed legacy was built in towers, wealth, contracts, and family names carved into stone. But now he saw that his mother's true legacy had been quieter. It had been a promise passed from one woman's dying hand into another woman's faithful life. Ruth turned to him. "I loved your mother," she said. "I know." "No," Ruth said gently. "You are beginning to know." Edward nodded, accepting the correction. They made tea in the small kitchen. Brianna opened the windows. The ocean air filled the room. For the first time in a very long while, Ruth sat while someone else served her. Edward placed a cup before her. It was not perfect. The tea was too strong. He forgot the sugar. Brianna had to quietly point to the spoons, but Ruth smiled as if he had done something grand. They sat together at the small round table. After a while, Edward said, "Will you live here?" Ruth looked around the cottage. "I think I will spend some days here," she said, "and some days at the estate." Edward listened carefully, not waiting to argue, not waiting to persuade, listening. "The estate was my home for many years," Ruth continued. "But I need this place too, not to leave you, to remember myself." Edward's eyes lowered. "You should never have had to ask for that." "I am not asking now," Ruth said. "I am telling you." He looked up, and then he smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The old phrase made Ruth laugh, a warm, surprised sound that seemed to loosen something in the walls. Weeks passed. The canceled wedding became talk for a while, then faded as all gossip does. Vanessa's name disappeared from the house. Her photographs were removed, her invitations withdrawn, her place at the table left empty until no one noticed it anymore. But Ruth's place was never empty again. At the estate, Edward changed the way she was introduced. Not loudly, not as a performance, simply and truthfully. "This is Miss Ruth Coleman," he would say. "She raised me." And every time he said it, he felt something inside him become cleaner. On Sunday afternoons, he drove to Rose Harbor with flowers, groceries, and no assistant waiting in the car. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they sat on the porch and watched gulls drift over the water. One afternoon, as the roses bloomed red along the fence, Ruth handed him his mother's letter. "You should keep it now," she said. Edward shook his head. "It belongs with you." Ruth smiled. "No, son. The promise was mine to carry. The lesson is yours." He took the letter with both hands. That evening, before leaving, Edward stood at the gate and looked back. Ruth was on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, the sea behind her and sunset resting gently on her gray curls. She looked smaller than the grand house she had served, smaller than the fortune Edward had built, smaller than the name Langford itself. Yet somehow, in that golden light, she seemed greater than all of it. Edward lifted his hand. Ruth lifted hers. And for the first time since he was 6 years old, Edward did not feel like a boy abandoned in a dark hallway. He felt like a man walking home,
with his mother's voice in his heart, and the woman who kept her promise finally standing in the light.